In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. Across 1,000,000 worlds, beneath alien stars, and upon battlefields that stretch beyond the horizon, the armies of the Imperium clash with Xenos horrors and heretical traitors in conflicts that consume entire planetary populations. Among these countless warriors, few inspire the kind of raw, primal terror that stops even the most battle-crazed combatants in their tracks. But there exists a weapon so fearsome, so utterly devastating, that even the savage Orks, creatures who live and breathe for violence, pause when they hear the thunderous footfalls approaching through the smoke and carnage. Picture this, if you will. A battlefield churning with the chaos of war. Thousands of greenskins surge forward in a tide of crude violence, their bellowing war cries shaking the very earth beneath them. These are the Orks, the galaxy's most enthusiastic practitioners of warfare. Xenos, whose entire existence revolves around the simple joy of a good scrap. They fear nothing. Death means nothing to them. Pain is merely an inconvenience. They charge headlong into fire that would make veteran guardsmen weep, laugh as their comrades are torn apart by bolter fire, and treat warfare like others might treat a festival. The WH40K energy flows through them like electric current, making them faster, stronger, more dangerous with every passing moment. And then they see it. Through the billowing smoke and the flash of explosions, a figure emerges. Golden armor catches the light of burning wreckage, but this is no ordinary custodian guard, standing perhaps 2.5 meters tall. This is something far more terrifying. This is a walking fortress, a towering engine of war that stands nearly 4 meters high, each footfall leaving impressions in the rockcrete beneath its weight. The Contemptor Achilles Dreadnought of the Adeptus Custodes has arrived, and with it comes something the Orks rarely experience: genuine, bone-deep fear. The greenskin advance falters. The smaller boys at the front of the mob actually take steps backward, their primitive brains registering a threat so overwhelming that even their fungal biology screams at them to run. The knobs bellow orders, trying to keep the momentum going, but there's a hesitation now, a crack in the usually unstoppable green tide. Some of the Orks have fought dreadnoughts before. They've traded blows with the walking tombs of the Astartes, those ponderous machines piloted by crippled space marines. Those fights were good fun, all things considered. Lots of dakka, lots of close combat, and if you were lucky and had enough boys with you, you could eventually mob the things and pull them apart. But this is different. The Custodian Dreadnought moves with a grace that should be impossible for something so massive. Where Space Marine dreadnoughts lumber and pivot with mechanical deliberation, this golden giant flows like water, each movement precise and purposeful. It raises one arm, and the Orks see a weapon that makes their crude shooters look like toys. The other arm terminates in a massive dread spear, a power weapon so large and so deadly that it could impale a battle wagon from front to back. The air around the machine seems to shimmer with barely contained power, the atomantic shielding crackling with energy that drinks in the Orks' scattered lasfire and crude rocket fire, as if they were nothing more than thrown stones. And then it charges. What happens next will be seared into the memory of every surviving Ork who witnesses it. The Custodian Dreadnought doesn't advance with the slow, methodical pace of lesser war machines. It accelerates with shocking speed, covering ground faster than many Orks can sprint. The dread spear sweeps through the first rank of boys like a scythe through wheat, the power field around the blade not just cutting, but disintegrating green flesh and crude armor. A knob, massive even by Ork standards, swings his power claw at the golden giant, confident in his strength. The Dreadnought's combat fist intercepts the blow with contemptuous ease, crushing the power claw and the arm that wielded it in a single hydraulic squeeze. Then that same fist punches forward, and the knob simply ceases to exist above the waist, reduced to a spray of blood and bone fragments. The Orks try to mob it, as they've mobbed so many enemies before. A dozen boys pile onto the Dreadnoughts' legs, choppers rising and falling in a frenzy of violence. But their blades spark harmlessly off armor crafted from auramite, a material so far beyond their comprehension that it might as well be sorcery. The Dreadnought doesn't even slow down. It simply continues its killing stroke, each movement precise, each blow fatal. A sweep of the Dread Spear removes 6 Orks from existence. A backhand from the Power Fist sends 3 more flying in broken heaps. The storm bolters mounted on its arms speak in staccato bursts, each shell finding its mark with machine precision, each impact tearing through green flesh. This is not the chaotic, grinding combat that Orks usually encounter. This is butchery. This is artistry written in greenskin blood. And for perhaps the first time in their violent lives, the Orks understand what it means to be outmatched, not just in strength or numbers, but in sheer, fundamental combat ability. But why? What is it about these particular war machines that breaks the Orkish love of battle? Why do Custodian Dreadnoughts inspire a fear that even Primarchs sometimes fail to generate in the greenskin hordes? To understand this, we need to delve deep into the nature of both species. The savage simplicity of the Orks, and the terrifying perfection of the Emperor's personal guardians, encased in blessed adamantium and auramite. The answer lies in a combination of factors that create a perfect storm of Orkish terror. It's not just the raw combat power, though that alone is staggering. It's not simply the near invulnerability, though Custodian Dreadnoughts can shrug off firepower that would reduce buildings to rubble. It's the combination of these factors with something far more insidious. These machines attack the very foundation of what makes Orks effective warriors. They disrupt the WAG energy itself, create a psychic pressure that causes the greenskin gestalt field to collapse, and they do it all while killing with an efficiency that borders on the supernatural. Over the next hour or so, we're going to explore every facet of this terrifying dynamic. We'll examine what makes Orks tick, what makes them fearless in the face of almost any enemy. Then we'll contrast that with the Custodian Dreadnoughts, war machines that combine the individual genius of the galaxy's finest warriors with technology that was ancient when the Imperium was young. We'll look at historical battles where Custodians faced Ork WH40Ks and emerged victorious against impossible odds. We'll examine the technical specifications that make these machines so deadly, and we'll explore the psychological impact these encounters have on Ork mobs, how the mere presence of a Custodian Dreadnought can shatter the confidence of even the most battle-hardened greenskins. The Savage Heart. Understanding Ork psychology and fearlessness. To truly comprehend why Custodian Dreadnoughts inspire such fear in Orks, we must first understand what it takes to scare an Ork in the first place. This is no simple task, because Orks are, by their very nature, perhaps the least fearful intelligent species in the entire galaxy. Where humans can be intimidated, where Eldar can know despair, where even Space Marines can feel the weight of impossible odds, Orks simply do not care. They were literally created by the Old Ones millions of years ago as weapons, biological war machines designed to fight an eternal war against the star gods themselves. And that fundamental purpose still echoes through their DNA. The Ork relationship with combat is not like that of other species. Humans fight for survival, for duty, for ideology. Even the most zealous Imperial guardsman charging into certain death is doing so because of training, conditioning, faith in the Emperor. There's a conscious decision being made, however quickly. But Orks? They fight because fighting is what they are. It's not a choice. It's not a duty. It's their fundamental state of being. A human who doesn't fight can still be human. An Ork who doesn't fight is not really an Ork at all. This distinction is crucial. When you watch an Ork mob charge across a killing field, laughing as heavy bolter fire tears through their ranks, it's not courage you're witnessing. Courage implies overcoming fear. The Orks simply don't have that fear to overcome. They're not being brave, they're being themselves. Death holds no terror for them because they barely comprehend it as a concept. Pain doesn't slow them because their physiology processes it as interesting feedback rather than as a warning. They're part fungus, part animal, and fully insane by human standards. The WH energy that flows through every orc reinforces this fearlessness. This is the Gestalt psychic field that all orcs generate and draw power from, a collective unconscious that grows stronger with every green skin in proximity. It's not just a battle cry, though it certainly is that. It's not just what they call their massive military campaigns, though it's that too. The WH is the fundamental organizing principle of orc existence, a psychic phenomenon that binds the species together and makes them far more than the sum of their parts. When enough orcs gather in one place, the WH energy reaches a critical mass. The air itself seems to shimmer with green psychic power. Lightning crackles between raised weapons. The orcs grow more aggressive, more coordinated, paradoxically smarter, even as they become more violent. Weapons that shouldn't work suddenly function perfectly. Vehicles held together with scrap metal and optimism run like precision machinery. And most importantly for our discussion, the orcs become essentially fearless. This psychic reinforcement loop is what makes orc WHs so terrifyingly effective. Each orc in the mob feeds energy into the field, and that energy feeds back to every individual orc, making them stronger, faster, tougher. The more orcs there are, the more powerful each individual becomes. It's a force multiplier that defies conventional military logic. A mob of 1,000 orcs isn't just 1,000 times as dangerous as a single orc. It's exponentially more dangerous because of the WH field they generate together. Under normal circumstances, this means that orcs simply do not break and run from battle. Imperial commanders who fought greenskins know this bitter truth all too well. You can't demoralize them with artillery. You can't break their lines with massed firepower. Even when they're losing badly, even when half their mob has been reduced to twitching corpses and scattered body parts, the survivors just keep coming. They'll charge straight into a firing line that's already killed hundreds of their kin, convinced that this time they'll make it through and get to the good part, the close combat. This psychological profile has been observed and documented by countless imperial forces over 10,000 years of conflict. The Departamento Munitorum has volumes of tactical doctrine specifically addressing the orc inability to fear. Guard commanders are trained to account for the fact that normal suppression tactics simply don't work on greenskins. Even when pinned down by heavy weapons fire, orcs will often just hunker behind cover and return fire with enthusiasm rather than terror. They treat battles the way human children might treat competitive games, with complete engagement and genuine fun. There are very, very few things in the galaxy that can actually scare an orc. Commissar Yarrick is one, but that's a special case born of decades of warfare on Armageddon, and the orcs' belief in his legendary status actually making him more dangerous through their own Gestalt field. Some particularly horrific chaos manifestations can give orcs pause, but only briefly, and usually just before they decide that fighting demons sounds like even more fun than normal. The Tyrannid hive mind's psychic pressure can disrupt WH energy, but even then, orcs are more likely to get confused than actually frightened. So when we say that Custodian Dreadnoughts inspire fear in orcs, we're talking about something truly exceptional. We're talking about a phenomenon so unusual, so contrary to orc nature, that it requires extraordinary circumstances to manifest. And those circumstances all revolve around the specific nature of what Custodian Dreadnoughts represent. The key lies in understanding that while orcs don't fear death, they do respect power. They understand, in their own brutal way, who's bigger and who's not. It's how their entire society is organized. The biggest, strongest orc is in charge because he's proven through violence that he deserves to be. This isn't fear in the way humans experience it, but it's something analogous. It's a recognition of superior killing ability, an acknowledgement that continuing to fight this particular enemy might not be proper fun at all. Orcs have a concept they call know when to leg it, though they rarely admit to it openly. It's not cowardice in their eyes, it's tactical repositioning, so you can come back and try again when you've got more boys. Smart orc leaders, the ones who live long enough to gather truly massive wages, understand this instinctively. If a fight isn't winnable right now, there's no shame in backing off to get more resources. After all, the fight will still be there tomorrow, and it'll be even better when you've got 3 times as many boys. This is the crack in the orcish psyche that Custodian Dreadnoughts exploit, though exploit might be too tactical a word for what's really happening. These walking fortresses of the Adeptus Custodes represent something so overwhelmingly dangerous, so far beyond the orcs' normal experience of combat, that even the WH40K energy itself recoils from them. The greenskins' psychic gestalt, which normally reinforces their aggression and fearlessness, encounters something it can't process, can't overcome, can't integrate into its understanding of how fights should go. When an orc mob encounters a Custodian Dreadnought, several things happen simultaneously on both the physical and psychic levels. Physically, they're confronted with a war machine that combines the durability of a super-heavy tank with the agility of an elite warrior and the killing power of an orbital strike. Psychically, the orc's gestalt field encounters what can only be described as a psychic void, where their normal confidence-boosting feedback should flow. The custodians themselves are nearly invisible to psychic powers, their souls shining so brightly that lesser psychic effects simply wash around them like water around a boulder. This property extends to their dreadnoughts, creating dead zones in the WH40K field. Imagine you're an orc boy, charging forward with your mob, feeling the power of the WH40K flowing through you. Every orc around you is feeding that power, and you're feeding it right back. You feel invincible, unstoppable, like you could take on the whole galaxy and win. And then suddenly, that feeling just stops. Not gradually, not fading away, but cut off like someone threw a switch. Right in front of you is this golden giant, and where it stands, the WH40K energy won't go. It's like trying to push through a wall you can't see. For an orc, this is deeply, fundamentally wrong. It's not pain. It's not even really fear in the traditional sense. It's a sensation of wrongness so profound that their simple brains struggle to process it. The thing in front of them shouldn't exist. It's not big enough to be that dangerous. It's not a gargant, not a stomper, not even particularly huge by vehicle standards. But it's killing, with an efficiency that makes no sense, moving with a speed that defies its size, and worst of all, it's not responding to the WH40K energy the way enemies should. Every species the orcs fight is affected by the WH40K to some degree. Humans get more desperate and panicky as the pressure builds. Even space marines can find their strategic thinking clouded by the psychic pressure of millions of screaming greenskins. But Custodian Dreadnoughts, they might as well be carved from stone for all the effect the WH40K has on them. They fight with the same cold, perfect precision, whether facing 10 orcs or 10,000. The psychic pressure that makes other enemies easier to kill just slides off their auramite armor like rain. This creates a cascade effect through the orc mob. The boys at the front, the ones actually in contact with the dreadnought, start backing up. Not running, not yet, but definitely not pressing forward with the usual enthusiasm. This hesitation spreads like a virus through the mob. The orcs behind the front rank can feel that something's wrong, that the WH40K energy is being disrupted somehow. The confidence that normally carries them through the worst fire begins to waver. And in that moment of hesitation, the Custodian Dreadnought does what it was built to do. It kills with prejudice and extreme efficiency. Each sweep of its dread spear removes multiple targets. Each shot from its weapons finds a vital target. It doesn't waste movement, doesn't make mistakes, doesn't pause or hesitate, or show the slightest uncertainty. It is death given form and purpose. And every orc it kills, weakens the WAG field further, creating a negative feedback loop that accelerates the mob's disintegration. This is what makes Custodian Dreadnoughts unique among the Imperium's weapons. A Space Marine Dreadnought, for all its power, still fights like a particularly tough infantry unit. It can be bogged down, surrounded, eventually overcome through sheer weight of numbers. But a Custodian Dreadnought fights like a force of nature. It doesn't just kill orcs, it breaks the psychic bonds that hold the mob together, turns their greatest strength against them. The more orcs that die to its weapons, the weaker the survivors become, the more that fundamental wrongness eats away at their confidence. So yes, orcs can feel fear. It just takes something truly exceptional to inspire it, something that operates on a level so far beyond normal warfare that even the orcs' fungal biology and psychic reinforcement can't paper over the fundamental mismatch in capability. Something like a Custodian Dreadnought, a machine that combines the skill of the galaxy's greatest warriors with technology from the dark age of humanity, piloted by a consciousness that has fought for centuries and seen empires rise and fall. The Emperor's Finest, the legend of the Adeptus Custodes. Before we can truly understand why the Custodian Dreadnoughts inspire such terror, we need to understand what the Adeptus Custodes themselves represent. These are not simply elite soldiers. They are not merely the best warriors humanity can produce. They are something fundamentally different, created through processes so arcane and individual that each custodian is essentially a unique work of art, a masterpiece of the Emperor's genetic craftsmanship. The Custodian Guard was founded during the Unification Wars on Terra, when the Emperor first began his campaign to unite humanity under a single banner. These were not his first warriors. The Thunder Warriors had served that purpose, brutal and powerful, but ultimately flawed and unstable. The Custodians were something else entirely, created not just to fight, but to be perfect. Where the Thunder Warriors were weapons, the Custodians were conceived as guardians, protectors not just of the Emperor's person, but of his vision for humanity itself. The process of creating a Space Marine is already phenomenally complex and dangerous. A suitable candidate must be selected from billions, tested to the point of destruction, surgically altered with 19 additional organs, hypno-indoctrinated with combat doctrines, trained for years or even decades. The resulting Astartes is a transhuman warrior, faster and stronger than any baseline human, capable of surviving wounds that would be instantly fatal to normal people, able to fight for days without rest. A single Space Marine is worth perhaps 10 or 20 highly trained soldiers in combat. It's an impressive achievement of biological engineering and military science. And yet, a Custodian looks at a Space Marine the way a Space Marine looks at a normal human. The difference in capability is that stark, that fundamental. Where Space Marines are mass-produced, and yes, even with all the ritual and difficulty, the process is ultimately about creating functional units in numbers large enough to fight galactic wars. Each Custodian is individually crafted by the Emperor's own hand, or by those who learned his arts directly from him. The genetic manipulation begins earlier, goes deeper, touches aspects of human biology that even the Mechanicus barely understands. Where a Space Marine receives 19 organs over the course of years, a Custodian's enhancement is so thorough that it's difficult to say where the human ends and the engineered warrior begins. Every cell is optimized, every system enhanced, all working in perfect harmony. The result is something that transcends what we normally think of as human capability. A Custodian stands taller than even a Space Marine, typically around 2.5 meters or more. Their golden armor is not just ceremonial, it's crafted from auramite, a material so rare and precious that it's essentially priceless, and so resilient that it makes ceramite look like paper. Their weapons are master-crafted by the finest artificers in the Imperium, each one a unique creation rather than a mass-produced tool. But the physical advantages, as impressive as they are only tell part of the story. What truly sets the Custodians apart is their minds. Space Marines are hypno-indoctrinated with standardized combat doctrines, taught to fight as units, to follow orders, to operate within the rigid command structure of their chapters. They're exceptional soldiers, but they are soldiers, following established patterns and strategies. Custodians are nothing like this. Each one is educated as a scholar, a philosopher, an artist. They don't just learn to fight, they learn to think, to understand, to see the broader picture of history and strategy and humanity's place in the galaxy. They're taught to question, to analyze, to make independent decisions based on perfect understanding rather than rote memorization. Where 10 Space Marines might work together as a tight squad, following tactical doctrine, 10 Custodians fight as 10 individual masters of combat who happen to be working toward the same goal. This philosophical approach to warfare manifests in how they fight. A Space Marine in a Dreadnought follows centuries of accumulated tactical wisdom, operating within established parameters and protocols. A Custodian in a Dreadnought brings not just combat skills, but genuine strategic genius, the ability to read a battlefield and make decisions that lesser warriors couldn't even conceive of. They don't just follow patterns, they create them, adapt them, transcend them in the moment. The historical record of the Custodian Guard speaks for itself. During the Great Crusade, when the Emperor led humanity's expansion across the galaxy, the Custodians were always at his side. They didn't fight in the grinding campaigns of attrition that characterized much of the Crusade. The Space Marine legions handled those. Instead, the Custodians were deployed when perfection was required, when anything less than absolute success would mean catastrophic failure. They fought on the most dangerous battlefields, faced the most powerful enemies, and never, ever failed in their duty to protect the Emperor. Consider the Battle of Gyros Thravian, an engagement that would become legendary in Imperial history. The Ork warlord, Garkul Blackfang, had created a wagi of such size and ferocity that 3 entire Space Marine legions were deployed to stop it. The Lunar Wolves under Horus himself, the Death Guard, and the Imperial Fists all converged on the Greenskin menace. These were not inexperienced troops or poorly equipped forces. These were 3 of the finest military formations in human history, led by Primarchs, demigod generals who had conquered hundreds of worlds, and they were losing. The sheer weight of the Ork numbers was overwhelming. For every 100 greenskins killed, it seemed like 200 more appeared. The Wag energy was at its height, making the Orks not just fearless, but genuinely formidable opponents. Space Marines were being dragged down and torn apart. Entire companies were in danger of being overrun. The Primarchs themselves were fighting desperately, killing Orks by the hundreds, but unable to stem the tide. Then the Emperor arrived. He didn't bring another legion. He didn't call for orbital bombardment or additional support. He brought 1,000 Custodians, just 1,000, against an Ork horde that numbered in the hundreds of thousands, possibly over 1 million. On paper, this should have been meaningless, a drop of water in an ocean of violence. Orks respect numbers after all, and they had the numbers to drown even the finest warriors through sheer attrition. What happened next defied all conventional military wisdom. The Custodians, led by the Emperor himself, crashed into the heart of the Ork horde, and they didn't just fight, they annihilated everything in their path. The historical accounts say that over 100,000 Orks died in that engagement, torn apart by guardian spears and bolter fire, crushed beneath golden boots and power-armored fists. The Wagi collapsed, not gradually, but catastrophically, as the psychic pressure of the Emperor's presence and his Custodians' killing efficiency simply broke the gestalt field that had held the horde together. The most telling detail of this battle is the casualty count. Over 100,000 Orks dead, 3 Custodians fell. 3. The Emperor himself engraved their names into his personal armor in honor of their sacrifice. These weren't just good odds. This was something that bordered on the supernatural, a kill ratio that seems impossible until you understand what custodians truly are. And here's the critical point. Those 1,000 custodians weren't in dreadnoughts. They were on foot, fighting as individual warriors armed with guardian spears and storm shields. The dreadnoughts came later, a necessary concession to the fact that even custodians can be injured beyond the ability of their enhanced bodies to heal. And when those first custodians were interred in their dreadnought sarcophagi, something remarkable happened. They became even more dangerous. The pilot of a custodian dreadnought is not some broken warrior being given one last chance to serve. These are heroes of the Adeptus Custodes, warriors who have already distinguished themselves in centuries of combat, who've mastered the arts of war to a degree that most species can't even comprehend. Being interred in a dreadnought doesn't diminish them, it enhances them, giving them strength and resilience that even their transhuman bodies couldn't match, while freeing them from the limitations of flesh. Consider Sagittarius, the first custodian to be wounded unto death and subsequently interred in a dreadnought. He was one of the original 30 custodians created by the Emperor's own hand, a warrior who had stood beside the master of mankind during the darkest days of the Unification Wars. When he fell in battle, wounded so severely that even custodian physiology couldn't save him, he chose to continue his service in the cold embrace of a dreadnought sarcophagus. He went on to serve for thousands of years, his legend growing with each battle, his skills refined to absolute perfection. Or consider Euryaxes, who fell defending the walls of the Imperial Palace during the War of the Beast in the 32nd Millennium. He fought against Orks so large and powerful that they made modern greenskins look like Gretchen, part of a warg so catastrophic that it nearly destroyed the Imperium itself. Even in his broken state, interred in his dreadnought, Euryaxes continued to serve, fighting through the millennia against enemies that would have destroyed entire Space Marine chapters. His combat record spans thousands of engagements, and he continues to fight in the current era. His debt to the Emperor never fully paid, because his standard of service is nothing less than absolute perfection. These are the warriors who pilot custodian dreadnoughts, not desperate soldiers clinging to a few more years of service, but masters of combat who view their internment as merely a change in equipment rather than a limitation. They bring centuries or even millennia of experience, skills honed against every enemy humanity has ever faced, and a level of dedication that borders on the religious. They are, quite simply, the finest warriors in the Imperium, and their dreadnoughts are their tools, extensions of their will rather than cages for their consciousness. When Orks face a Space Marine dreadnought, they're fighting a skilled pilot operating a powerful war machine. When they face a custodian dreadnought, they're fighting a legend given mechanical form, a master of war who's forgotten more about combat than most species will ever learn. The difference is not just quantitative, but qualitative, a fundamental gap in capability that no amount of Orkish enthusiasm can bridge. Walking gods of war, the terrible majesty of custodian dreadnoughts. Now we come to the heart of our exploration. The dreadnoughts themselves, these walking masterpieces of war that combine the finest warriors with the finest technology to create something that transcends normal military capabilities. To understand why Orks fear these machines, we need to examine not just what they are, but what they represent and how they operate on the battlefield. The standard Contemptor pattern dreadnought used by the Adeptus Astartes is already an impressive piece of military hardware. Standing nearly 4 meters tall, armored in thick ceramite, powered by an atomantic arc reactor that gives it strength and speed beyond what its size would suggest, it's a formidable opponent. A single Contemptor can hold a defensive position against dozens of enemy infantry, destroy enemy armor with its weapon systems, and survive firepower that would reduce buildings to rubble. Space Marine chapters, treasure their contemptors as precious relics from the Great Crusade era, machines that embody the technical prowess of a bygone age. The Custodian variants of the Contemptor, however, operate on an entirely different level. The Contemptor Achilles, the Contemptor Galatus, and the standard venerable Contemptor Dreadnought of the Adeptus Custodes share only superficial similarities with their Astartes counterparts. They're built with materials that the Mechanicus can barely replicate, armed with weapons that are as much works of art as instruments of destruction, and most importantly, they move and fight with a fluidity that seems impossible for something so massive. Let's start with the most widely deployed variant, the Contemptor Achilles. This is the general battle unit of the Custodian Dreadnoughts, combining phenomenal strength and speed with what the historical records describe as the echoes of the interred Custodian's own unmatched martial skill. That last part is crucial. The Achilles doesn't just move quickly for a dreadnought, it fights with the technical precision of its pilot, executing combat maneuvers that would be impressive for a human-sized warrior, let alone a 4-meter-tall war machine. The primary weapon of the Achilles is the Dreadspear, a massive version of the Guardian Spear carried by foot-mobile Custodians. This isn't simply a power weapon scaled up to dreadnought proportions. The Dreadspear is a masterwork of artificer craftsmanship, incorporating technologies that date back to the dark age of technology. Its power field doesn't just enhance cutting ability, it disrupts matter at the molecular level, allowing the weapon to punch through armor that should be impervious to physical strikes. The integrated Corvée Las Pulsar adds ranged capability, firing focused energy beams that can cripple vehicles or vaporize infantry with equal ease. But the real terror of the Achilles lies not in its armament, but in how it uses that armament. The pilot retains all the skills and techniques mastered over centuries of combat. They don't simply swing the Dreadspear like a club, they wield it with the same precision they once wielded their Guardian Spear, executing forms and techniques that are nothing short of beautiful in their deadly efficiency. An Achilles, advancing through an enemy formation, is poetry written in violence, each movement economical, each strike perfectly placed, nothing wasted. The Contemptor Galatus takes a different approach to the battlefield. Where the Achilles is the general battle unit, the Galatus is designed as a mobile anchor point, analogous to the Sentinel Guard formations that hold critical positions while other Custodians maneuver. It's armed with the Galatus Warblade, a massive power sword that can shear through ranks of armored infantry with single sweeps, and more importantly, it carries the Presidium Shield, a scaled-up version of the energy-reinforced battle shields used by Sentinel Guards. This shield is perhaps the most impressive defensive technology in the Imperium's arsenal. Already, the Galatus chassis is nigh impregnable, with armor thicker than many tanks, and an atomantic shield that can turn aside even the heaviest firepower. The Presidium Shield adds another layer of protection, an energy field so powerful that lasfire simply vanishes into it. Bolter rounds are deflected without even scratching the underlying surface, and even anti-tank weapons struggle to penetrate its defenses. A Galatus can quite literally walk through firepower that would level a building and emerge on the other side completely unscathed. When Orks encounter a Galatus, they face something that defies their entire understanding of combat. They throw everything they have at this golden giant: rockets, big shooters, power claws, entire mobs of boys with choppers raised high, and nothing works. The Galatus doesn't even slow down, it just keeps advancing, that massive warblade sweeping back and forth in precise arcs, each swing removing chunks of the Ork formation. The built-in Infernus incinerators add to the carnage, spewing superheated promethium that reduces Orks to carbonized husks. And all the while, the Galatus is advancing, inexorable, unstoppable, a walking fortress that kills with the precision of a master swordsman. The venerable Contemptor, while less specialized than the Achilles or Galatus, brings its own terrors to the battlefield. These are typically equipped with more flexible loadouts, multi-melters for vehicle destruction, Keres pattern assault cannons for anti-infantry work, and a Contemptor combat weapon that can tear apart light vehicles and heavy infantry alike. But what makes them particularly devastating is their pilots. These are often custodians who've been interred for millennia, warriors who've seen every kind of warfare the galaxy has to offer and adapted their tactics accordingly. A venerable Contemptor fights with a wisdom that only comes from thousands of years of combat experience. It doesn't just react to the tactical situation, it predicts it, reading the flow of battle with the same ease that lesser warriors read a map. It positions itself perfectly, ensures its sightlines are clear, times its charges with mathematical precision. When it engages, it does so with the absolute minimum expenditure of resources necessary to achieve maximum effect. Every shot counts. Every melee strike is lethal. There's no wasted effort, no unnecessary risk-taking, just cold, calculated violence executed with perfection. All three variants share certain common features that make them particularly terrifying to face. The atomantic shielding, a technology so advanced that modern tech priests can barely maintain it, let alone replicate it, provides a defensive benefit that goes beyond simple armor. When projectiles strike the shield, they're met with a burst of energy that disrupts their trajectory and dissipates their force. High-energy weapons like lasfire and plasma have their energy bled away. Kinetic projectiles lose momentum. Even explosions seem to slide around the shield's envelope rather than impacting fully. It's not invulnerability, but it's close enough that most enemies might as well be throwing rocks. The chassis itself is constructed from auramite, the same material used in Custodian armor. This isn't just rare, it's functionally irreplaceable in the modern era. The secrets of its manufacture were known only to the Emperor and a handful of his closest servants, and much of that knowledge has been lost over the millennia. Existing auramite is hoarded by the Adeptus Custodes, recycled and reforged when necessary, but never wasted. When you face a Custodian Dreadnought, you're fighting something that was already ancient when the Imperium was young, crafted with arts that the current age can barely understand. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Custodian Dreadnoughts is their speed. Space Marine Dreadnoughts are not slow exactly, but they move with a deliberate, mechanical gait that prioritizes stability and firing platform efficiency over pure velocity. They advance at a measured pace, stop to fire, pivot with careful precision. They're powerful, yes, but also somewhat predictable in their movement patterns. Custodian Dreadnoughts move like their pilots once moved on foot, which is to say, like lightning given form and purpose. The atomantic arc reactor provides power far beyond what standard Dreadnought reactors can manage, translated into acceleration and maneuverability that seem impossible for something weighing several tons. An Achilles can charge across a battlefield faster than many infantry can sprint, weaving between obstacles with fluid grace. A Galatus can pivot on a single foot and bring its shield to bear against an unexpected threat with reaction time measured in fractions of a second. This combination of speed, power, and skill creates a combat package that's almost impossible to counter through conventional means. You can't outmaneuver them because they're faster and more agile than you expect. You can't overpower them because their armor and shields make them nearly invulnerable. You can't outlast them because their pilots have been fighting for centuries and know every trick, every tactic, every desperation move you might attempt. And you absolutely cannot overwhelm them through numbers because each one can kill dozens or even hundreds of enemies before needing to withdraw, and they very rarely need to withdraw. The weapon systems deserve special attention because they represent the pinnacle of Imperial military technology. The Dread Spear isn't just a spear, it's a power weapon incorporating a ranged energy projector, with targeting systems so sophisticated that they can track multiple targets simultaneously and prioritize based on threat assessment that happens faster than conscious thought. The Galatus Warblade doesn't just cut, it resonates at frequencies that disrupt molecular bonds, allowing it to slice through materials that should be impervious to physical attack. Even the standard weapons like multi-melters and assault cannons are master-crafted versions superior to those mounted on other Imperial vehicles. And then there's the most overlooked, but perhaps most important aspect. These weapons are wielded with skill. A Space Marine Dreadnought shoots its multi-melter effectively because its targeting systems are good and its pilot is trained. A Custodian Dreadnought shoots its multi-melter with pinpoint precision because its pilot could probably make that shot with iron sights and their eyes closed, having made similar shots thousands of times across centuries of warfare. The machine makes the shot possible. The pilot makes it perfect. When you add all of these factors together, the impenetrable defenses, the devastating weapons, the impossible speed and agility, the centuries or millennia of combat experience in the pilot, you get something that transcends normal warfare. These aren't just powerful units in the game of military conflict. They're game enders, pieces that can single-handedly turn the tide of battles that would otherwise be lost. And when Orks encounter them, all the confidence that the WH energy provides evaporates like morning fog under the midday sun. The historic slaughter, when golden gods walked among greenskins. History is written by the victors, the saying goes, but in the grim darkness of the far future, history is written by the survivors, and the survivors of Custodian encounters are invariably on the Golden Warrior's side. The annals of the Imperium contain numerous accounts of battles between the Emperor's Guardians and the Greenskin Menace, and these accounts share a common thread. They read less like combat reports and more like descriptions of natural disasters. The Battle of Gyros Thravian, which we touched on earlier, deserves much deeper examination because it established the template for what happens when Custodians face Orks in significant numbers. The historical accounts preserved by the remembrances and the Imperial historians paint a picture that, even allowing for embellishment and Imperial propaganda, remains almost unbelievable in its one-sided nature. The Ork warlord, Garkle Blackfang, was, by all accounts, one of the most formidable greenskin leaders ever encountered during the Great Crusade. His YAGL had consumed multiple star systems, destroyed Imperial army regiments by the dozen, and grown to such proportions that it represented a genuine threat to the Crusade's momentum in that sector of space. When the Lunar Wolves, Death Guard, and Imperial Fists were committed to the campaign, it was with the expectation that 3 legions should be more than sufficient to crush any Ork threat, no matter how large. They were wrong, not because the legions fought poorly. On the contrary, they executed flawless combined arms warfare, with the Lunar Wolves' speed complementing the Death Guard's implacable advance and the Imperial Fist's defensive expertise. They killed Orks by the tens of thousands, destroyed Gargants and Stompers, eliminated Ork leadership figures by the score. And still the Greenskins kept coming, kept fighting, kept dying and laughing about it. The WAG energy was at its absolute height. With so many Orks concentrated in one region of the battlefield, the Gestalt field was powerful enough that even non-psychers could feel it pressing against their minds. Ork weapons that should have been too crude to function were working with disturbing efficiency. Ork vehicles that looked like they'd fall apart if you breathed on them were shrugging off weapons fire that should have reduced them to scrap. The Greenskins were fighting with a coordination and intelligence that belied their savage reputation. And then the Emperor arrived aboard the Bucephalus, his golden battle barge, with 1,000 of his Custodian guard. The accounts describe what happened next with language that borders on the divine. The Custodians deployed from their transports in perfect formation, a golden wave that crashed into the Ork horde like a tsunami striking a beach. And where that wave passed, only corpses remained. The Custodians advanced in a precise line, their guardian spears blazing with power fields and their storm shields turning aside the desperate fire of thousands of Orks. But this wasn't the grinding, attritional warfare that characterized the Space Marine assault. This was something else entirely. The Custodians moved through the Ork mob like dancers, each warrior a center of destruction that killed with every movement. Spears thrust forward with precision that defied belief, each strike finding a vital point, through an Ork's eye and into its brain, through the gap in a nob's crude armor, into the machinery of a Wartrack's engine block. The Emperor himself led from the front, not because he needed to, but because his presence had a palpable effect on both his own forces and the enemy. When he struck down Garkle Blackfang atop the Orcs' own Gargant, the act sent psychic shockwaves through the entire WAG. This wasn't just a war boss dying. This was the central pillar of the Orc Gestalt field being removed with such overwhelming force that the psychic backlash could be felt across the entire battlefield. But even without the Emperor's presence, the Custodians were systematically destroying the Orc formation. The historical records indicate that the average Custodian in that battle accounted for over 100 confirmed kills, and this is almost certainly an undercount because the battlefield was so chaotic that precise tallies were impossible. Some Custodians doubtless killed far more, cutting through entire mobs single-handedly, while their brothers provided covering fire and tactical support. The psychological effect on the Orcs was catastrophic. The WAG energy didn't just weaken, it shattered. Suddenly, the confidence that had carried the Greenskins through weeks of brutal combat evaporated. They saw their strongest warriors cut down like wheat before the scythe. They watched their war boss, a giant among Orcs, fall before the Emperor's blade, and they felt, perhaps for the first time in their violent lives, genuine fear. The Orcs broke. Not a tactical withdrawal, not a repositioning to try a different angle of attack, but a complete rout. Greenskins turned and ran, trampling their own kind in their desperate attempt to escape the Golden Reapers. And the Custodians pursued them, running down fleeing Orcs with remorseless efficiency, ensuring that as few as possible escaped to spread their spores and begin the cycle anew. Now, as impressive as 1,000-foot mobile Custodians were, imagine that same capability packaged in Dreadnought form. This is exactly what happened in the years following the Horus Heresy, as the first Custodians were interred in their mechanical bodies and deployed against the Imperium's enemies. One particularly well-documented engagement occurred during the War of the Beast in the 32nd Millennium. This was the largest Orc wave since the Ullanor Crusade, led by a prime Orc of such size and power that he nearly destroyed the Imperium entirely. The Orcs of this WAG were not the degraded versions that would be encountered in later millennia. These were closer to the original Krork, massive and intelligent in ways that modern Greenskins simply aren't. The Custodian Guard deployed several Dreadnoughts to the defense of the Imperial Palace when Orc forces threatened Terra itself. Among them was Uriaxes, who would go on to serve for thousands of years afterward. The accounts of this battle describe Dreadnoughts advancing through Orc hordes that would have overwhelmed Space Marine forces, killing with such efficiency that entire mobs would disintegrate before them. One particularly vivid account describes a Contemptor Galatus holding a breach in the palace walls for 6 hours against constant Orc assault. The Orcs came in waves, thousands upon thousands of them, throwing themselves at this single golden giant with all the fury they could muster. And for 6 hours, that Galatus didn't give a single meter of ground. Its Galatus warblade swept back and forth in never-ending arcs, its Infernus incinerator reducing greenskin flesh to ash, its Presidium shield turning aside rockets and heavy weapons fire as if they were thrown stones. When reinforcements finally arrived, they found the Galatus still standing, surrounded by such a mountain of Orc corpses that the bodies were piled several meters high. The Dreadnought's armor was scorched and pitted, but its systems were still operational, and its pilot was requesting assignment to the next crisis point. The psychological impact on the Orcs who survived that breach assault was profound. They spread tales of the golden giant that could not be killed, the metal monster that drank their bullets and returned only death. More recent engagements have reinforced this pattern. During the Third War for Armageddon, when Ghazghkull Thraka's massive WAG threatened one of the Imperium's most important hive worlds, Custodian forces were deployed to several critical sectors. While the bulk of the fighting was done by Space Marines and Imperial Guard, the Custodians and their Dreadnoughts were held in reserve for crisis points, moments when the Ork assault threatened to break through and the entire battle teetered on a knife's edge. In one such engagement, a single Contemptor Achilles was deployed to stabilize a collapsing defensive line. An entire company of Blood Angels had been overrun, their position compromised by a mob of thousands of Orks, led by multiple war bosses. The situation was desperate. The Orks were about to break into the hive proper, which would have required months of brutal urban warfare to clean out. The Achilles arrived via drop pod, smashing into the Ork formation like a meteor strike. Before the Greenskins could even register what was happening, its dread spear had already killed 2 of the war bosses, the power field punching through their armor and obliterating their torsos in sprays of blood and bone. The assault continued without pause, the Dreadnought moving through the Ork mob with impossible grace, each movement optimized for maximum lethality. The Blood Angels, rallying around this golden pillar of destruction, launched a counterattack. What should have been a desperate last stand turned into a complete reversal of fortune. The Orks, suddenly uncertain and disorganized, found themselves caught between the revitalized Space Marines and a Custodian Dreadnought that was killing them faster than they could retreat. By the time the engagement ended 2 hours later, the entire Ork mob had been destroyed, and the defensive line was not just stabilized, but actually advanced several hundred meters. These accounts share common elements that help us understand the Ork response to Custodian Dreadnoughts. First, there's always a moment of initial contact where the Orks don't quite understand what they're facing. They see a Dreadnought, they've fought Dreadnoughts before, and they charge in with typical greenskin enthusiasm. This usually lasts about 30 seconds, just long enough for the Custodian Dreadnought to demonstrate that it's not like the ones they've fought before. Then comes the confusion phase. The Orks at the front of the mob are dying too quickly, their attacks having no effect, their best warriors falling like chaff. The ones behind press forward, not yet understanding the threat, still riding the way energy's confidence boost. This creates a compression effect where Orks are being forced forward by their fellows, even as they're being systematically slaughtered. Finally comes the breaking point, where the way-ag energy itself starts to collapse. This usually happens when the Custodian Dreadnought kills a visible leader, a war boss, or particularly large knob, with such overwhelming force that every Ork can see it happen. The psychological impact ripples through the mob like a shockwave. The ones at the front try to back up, but there are hundreds or thousands of Orks behind them still pushing forward. Panic sets in. The Gestalt field wavers and breaks. And that's when the true slaughter begins, because a Custodian Dreadnought, fighting demoralized, scattered Orks, is even more efficient than one fighting an organized mob. It can pick targets at leisure, pursue fleeing enemies, ensure maximum casualties. The average engagement time for a single Custodian Dreadnought versus an Ork mob of moderate size, say a few hundred boys, is measured in minutes, not hours. And at the end of those minutes, the Dreadnought is operational and ready for the next engagement, while the Ork mob has ceased to exist as a fighting force. This pattern has repeated across thousands of battlefields over 10 millennia of Imperial history. Each time, the result is roughly the same. The Orks fight with their usual enthusiasm until they encounter the Custodian Dreadnought, at which point their confidence evaporates and their formation disintegrates. It's not a fight, it's pest control, executed with the kind of brutal efficiency that only the Emperor's finest warriors can deliver. The Golden Thunder, understanding the combat superiority. Let's examine in detail what makes a Custodian Dreadnought so overwhelmingly superior in combat, because understanding the mechanical reality helps explain the psychological impact on Orks. This isn't just about having better weapons or thicker armor, though those certainly help. It's about the combination of factors that create a combat platform so far beyond normal capabilities that it operates according to different rules than everything else on the battlefield. Start with the physical statistics, because numbers tell a story all their own. A Custodian Contemptor Dreadnought stands approximately 4 meters tall and masses several tons, even before accounting for weapons and ammunition. It's protected by armor that would be considered excessive on a battle tank. Layered auramite plates, backed by the adamantic shielding we discussed earlier. This creates a defensive profile that can shrug off weapons fire that would reduce lesser vehicles to molten slag. To put this in concrete terms, a standard Space Marine Dreadnought has impressive armor, rated to withstand hits from most infantry weapons and even some anti-armor weapons without critical damage. A Custodian Dreadnought's armor is measurably superior, manufactured from materials and using techniques that produce protection so effective that even dedicated anti-tank weapons struggle to penetrate it. When you add the adamantic shielding, which provides what amounts to a constantly regenerating energy barrier, you're looking at something that can walk through firestorms that would vaporize everything else on the battlefield. The offensive capabilities are equally impressive. Let's focus on the Contemptor Achilles as our primary example, since it's the most common variant. The Dread Spear alone is a weapon system that most factions would consider overpowered. It's a power weapon large enough to impale enemy vehicles, with a power field so intense that it can punch through the heaviest armor in the galaxy. The molecular disruption effect means that even glancing blows from the Dread Spear are often fatal. Armor doesn't just get cut, it gets disintegrated, and the bodies inside simply cease to exist in recognizable form. The Dread Spear's integrated las pulsar provides ranged capability that's anything but secondary. This isn't just a backup weapon, it's a focused energy projector capable of burning through armor at ranges where most enemies can't effectively return fire. A Custodian pilot, with their centuries of combat experience and transhuman reaction times enhanced by the Dreadnought's sensory systems, can track multiple fast-moving targets simultaneously and engage them with accuracy that borders on precognitive. The secondary weapon systems, typically either Lastrum storm bolters or Infernus incinerators, add another layer of lethality. These aren't standard pattern weapons, but master-crafted variants that incorporate technologies lost to most of the Imperium. The storm bolters fire mass reactive shells that can track targets with their own miniature guidance systems. The incinerators project streams of superheated promethium mixed with alchemical compounds that make it burn hotter and longer than standard flamer fuel. An orc caught in an Infernus incinerator blast doesn't just burn, it flash vaporizes, leaving behind only a silhouette of ash. But raw firepower and protection only tell part of the story. What makes Custodian Dreadnoughts truly terrifying is how they use these capabilities. The pilot is the key. They bring to the P's. Engagement, not just weapons, but wisdom. Not just armor, but awareness. Not just strength, but skill. Consider how a typical engagement might unfold. An orc mob spots the Custodian Dreadnought and charges, as orcs do. The Dreadnought doesn't simply stand and fight. It analyzes the mob's composition in milliseconds. Are there any particularly large orcs that are likely providing leadership? Target them first. Are there any vehicle threats? Mark them for priority elimination. Is the terrain advantageous, or should position be adjusted? All of this happens faster than conscious thought, processed through a combination of the pilot's experience and the Dreadnought's sophisticated tactical cogitators. As the mob closes, the Dreadnought opens fire. Not a wild spray of bullets hoping to hit something, but precisely aimed bursts where every shell counts. The storm bolters speak in measured staccato, each burst dropping an orc with shots to center mass or head. The larger targets, the knobs and any orcs with heavy weapons, are engaged by the Dreadspear's las pulsar, burning through their armor in focused beams that leave glowing holes through torsos and heads. This isn't suppressive fire, this is marksmanship elevated to an art form. The orcs, who survive the initial ranged engagement close to melee distance, which is exactly where they want to be, where their numbers should give them an advantage, where their strength and enthusiasm should overwhelm any single opponent. And this is where the Custodian Dreadnought demonstrates why it's so feared. The Dreadspear sweeps horizontally at chest height, moving with a speed that seems impossible for something so massive. The power field extends perhaps a meter beyond the physical blade, and anything within that envelope simply ceases to exist in the conventional sense. Orks aren't cut or stabbed. They're disintegrated, their crude armor and tough flesh proving no more effective than tissue paper. A single sweep might kill 5 or 6 orks, and the Dreadnought can execute multiple such sweeps per second. The Dreadnought doesn't stand still to fight. It moves constantly, positioning itself to maximize its advantages and minimize the Orks' ability to coordinate. It uses the terrain, ensures that attacking Orks get in each other's way, creates kill zones where every angle of approach requires the greenskins to expose themselves to lethal fire. All of this happens with a fluidity that would be impressive in a human-sized warrior and is simply breathtaking in something weighing several tons. The Combat Fist, the Dreadnought's other close combat weapon, isn't just for crushing. It's a precision instrument that can grasp and throw enemies, can punch through vehicle armor, can block incoming attacks while simultaneously serving as a stable firing platform. When an Ork powerclaw swings toward the Dreadnought, the fist intercepts it, not through blind luck, but through calculated positioning that neutralizes the attack while setting up the counterstrike. The hydraulic crushing power is so immense that even the strongest Orks simply pop when caught in its grip. Their bones pulverized to powder and their organs reduced to paste. Throughout all of this, the Dreadnought's sensory systems are feeding the pilot information at a rate that would overwhelm a normal human brain. Threat assessments, ammunition counts, armor integrity reports, tactical analysis of the evolving battlefield, all of it processed in real time, all of it used to make micro-adjustments that optimize the Dreadnought's performance. The pilot sees everything, processes everything, responds to everything with an efficiency that makes them seem omniscient to observers. The speed deserves special emphasis because it's perhaps the most unexpected aspect of Custodian Dreadnought combat performance. When people think Dreadnought, they typically imagine something slow and ponderous, advancing with mechanical determination, but not much grace. Custodian Dreadnoughts shatter that expectation completely. They can accelerate to speeds that let them run down fleeing infantry, can pivot and reverse direction with reaction times measured in fractions of a second, can leap over obstacles that would stop other vehicles cold. This speed isn't just about the reactor providing more power, though that helps. It's about the pilot's skill in using that power. A less skilled operator given the same chassis would still be slower because they'd overcorrect, they'd waste motion, they'd take the safe route instead of the optimal one. The Custodian pilot has internalized the Dreadnought's capabilities so thoroughly that operating it is as natural as their original body once was. They don't think move left foot, shift weight, pivot right. They simply move, and the machine responds as if it were their own flesh. The combat endurance is another crucial factor. Space Marine Dreadnoughts are impressive, but they do eventually run low on ammunition, need to withdraw for repairs, require support to remain combat effective. Custodian Dreadnoughts seem to operate on a different scale entirely. The ammunition supplies are larger. The armor repairs itself through arcane systems that draw power from the atomantic reactor. The pilot's consciousness is so perfectly integrated with the machine that they can fight effectively even while systems are degraded. There are accounts of Custodian Dreadnoughts remaining in continuous combat for days without withdrawal, killing without pause, advancing through enemies that seemed endless. The pilots don't experience fatigue the way embodied Custodians do. They're sustained by the Dreadnought's life support systems, fed nutrients and combat stims that keep their consciousness sharp even through extended engagements. They can fight literally until the Dreadnought's physical systems fail, and those systems are so robust that failure is almost unheard of. When you combine all these factors, the impenetrable defenses, the overwhelming firepower, the impossible speed and agility, the pilot's centuries of experience, the mechanical endurance that never falters. You get something that operates outside the normal parameters of warfare. This isn't a unit you defeat through tactical superiority because it's already optimized its tactics. This isn't a unit you overwhelm through numbers because it kills faster than you can reinforce. This isn't a unit you outlast because it doesn't tire. For orcs, who understand warfare in terms of being bigger, stronger, and tougher than the enemy, Custodian Dreadnoughts represent an existential challenge. They're not bigger than a war boss in a mega armor suit, but they fight as if they are. They're not tougher than a battle wagon, but they take punishment as if they are. They're not stronger than a mob of knobs working together, but they kill as if they are. Every assumption the orcs make about how fights should work gets violated, and their simple brains struggle to process the disconnect between what they expect and what they experience. This is why orcs fear Custodian Dreadnoughts. Not because the machines are invincible, nothing is truly invincible in the 41st Millennium, but because they represent a level of combat capability so far beyond the orcs' normal experience that their instinctive understanding of warfare simply breaks down. When an orc fights, they rely on their toughness, their numbers, and the WH energy to carry them through. Against a Custodian Dreadnought, none of those advantages matter. And in that moment of realization, when the orc understands that they're not just losing but being systematically dismantled by something operating on a completely different level, that's when the fear sets in. The psychic void, how dreadnoughts break the To truly understand the orc fear of Custodian Dreadnoughts, we need to examine something that doesn't appear in traditional combat reports or tactical assessments, the psychic dimension of these encounters. The WH energy that makes orcs so dangerous is also their greatest vulnerability, and Custodian Dreadnoughts exploit this vulnerability in ways that most Imperial forces can't replicate. Remember that the WH field is fundamentally a psychic phenomenon. It's generated by the collective unconscious of the orcs, a gestalt field that grows stronger as more greenskins gather together and as they engage in violence. This field provides tangible benefits. It makes their ramshackle technology work. It reinforces their courage. It enhances their physical capabilities. And most importantly, it creates a feedback loop where success breeds more success. When an orc mob is winning, when they're charging forward and killing enemies, the WH energy surges. This makes them individually more dangerous, which helps them kill more enemies, which strengthens the field further. It's a positive feedback loop that can turn a marginal advantage into a devastating rout. Conversely, when orcs start losing badly, the field weakens, which makes them less effective, which causes them to lose harder, creating a negative feedback loop that can collapse an entire WH. Custodians in general, and Custodian Dreadnoughts specifically, are uniquely positioned to trigger this negative feedback loop. The reason lies in the fundamental nature of what Custodians are. They were created not just to be warriors, but to be perfect warriors. And that perfection extends to their psychic presence, or more accurately, their psychic absence. Human psychers describe seeing Custodians in the warp as almost painful. They shine so brightly that they're difficult to look at directly, their souls blazing with an intensity that marks them as the Emperor's own handiwork. But from a different perspective, particularly one focused on the kind of crude, gestalt psychic fields that orcs generate, Custodians appear as voids, as places where psychic energy simply won't go. Their perfect nature makes them resistant to psychic influence in ways that even other exceptional warriors aren't. This property extends to their dreadnoughts. The machine itself isn't psychically null. It's made of metal and auramite, which have no inherent psychic resistance. But the pilot within creates a kind of dead zone, a sphere of psychic emptiness that extends perhaps a dozen meters around the Dreadnought. Within this zone, the WH40K energy doesn't flow properly. It encounters resistance, gets disrupted, fails to reinforce the way it should. For an Ork standing near a Custodian Dreadnought, the effect is profoundly disorienting. Imagine you've spent your entire life breathing normally, never thinking about it, and suddenly the air becomes thin. You can still breathe, technically, but it's harder, less satisfying, and you're constantly aware of the lack. That's what Orks experience when they encounter the psychic void around a Custodian Dreadnought. The WH energy is still there, but it's muted, weakened, insufficient. This has cascading effects on Ork combat effectiveness. Their weapons, which rely partly on the WH field to function properly, become less reliable. A shooter that was working perfectly moments ago starts to jam or misfire. A rocket launcher that should blow apart a tank merely damages it. The crude repairs and improvised modifications that keep Ork technology functional begin to fail because the unconscious psychic reinforcement isn't there to make them work despite their physical shortcomings. The Orks themselves become measurably weaker and slower. Not dramatically. We're not talking about Orks suddenly becoming as fragile as humans. But the enhancement they normally receive from the WH field is absent, meaning they're operating at their baseline capability rather than their amplified effectiveness. An Ork nob who could normally shrug off wounds that would kill a human 3 times over finds himself bleeding more freely, hurting more intensely, moving more slowly than he expects. The psychological impact is even more severe than the physical effects. The WH energy provides Orks with confidence, with the bone-deep certainty that they're going to win because fighting is what they're built for. When that confidence is stripped away, what's left is just the biological organism, still dangerous, still aggressive, but now experiencing something disturbingly close to doubt. Custodian Dreadnoughts amplify this effect through their combat performance. It's one thing for the WH energy to be disrupted in an abstract sense. It's quite another for that disruption to be accompanied by the visible slaughter of your mob. The Orks watch as their strongest warriors, the nobs and bosses who've proven their worth through countless fights, get cut down like grots. They see their crude but effective weapons sparking harmlessly off armor that shouldn't be that tough. They feel the WH energy weakening even as they desperately need it to strengthen. This creates a panic spiral that's unique to Ork psychology. Other species might root when they calculate that victory is impossible, when the casualties become unacceptable, when their morale breaks. Orks don't really think that way. They're more likely to keep fighting even when they're clearly losing, because fighting is intrinsically satisfying to them. But when the WH energy collapses, they're not making a rational decision to retreat. They're experiencing a fundamental wrongness that overrides their normal responses. The larger the mob, the more catastrophic this collapse becomes. Remember that the WH field is a network phenomenon. Each Ork contributes to it and draws from it. When the Orks at the front, the ones in direct contact with the Custodian Dreadnought, start to panic, their panic feeds back into the field. The Orks behind them feel the disruption, become uncertain, and their uncertainty weakens the field further. It spreads through the mob like a contagion, each Ork's fear reinforcing and amplifying every other Ork's fear. This is why you see accounts of entire Ork WHs collapsing when they encounter concentrated Custodian forces. It's not just that the Custodians are killing Orks efficiently, though they certainly are. It's that each Custodian, and each Custodian Dreadnought, is creating a zone of disruption in the WH field, and when multiple zones overlap and intersect, they can cause cascade failures in the Gestalt consciousness that holds the whole mob together. Historical accounts from the War of the Beast describe this phenomenon in vivid detail. When the Custodians deployed to defend the Imperial Palace, they created what observers described as golden bastions, around which the Ork assault seemed to break like waves on a shore. But it wasn't just physical obstruction. The Orks were actively avoiding areas where Custodian Dreadnoughts had established position, flowing around them even when those positions were tactically vulnerable from other angles. The Orks weren't consciously deciding to avoid the Dreadnoughts. They were responding to instincts that told them, at the most fundamental level, that those golden giants were wrong, were dangerous in ways that went beyond simple physical threat. The WH energy was steering them away, trying to flow around the disruption points rather than through them. And when they were forced to engage, when tactical necessity or the press of Orks behind them left no choice, they fought with notably less enthusiasm than usual, their blows less committed, their charges less aggressive. This psychic dimension also explains some of the more unusual Ork behaviors recorded after encounters with Custodian Dreadnoughts. Surviving Orks don't talk about these fights the way they normally talk about battles. Usually Orks will boast about their fights, embellish the details, turn even defeats into stories worth telling. But Orks who've faced Custodian Dreadnoughts and lived to tell about it, which isn't many, admittedly, tend to be quieter about the experience. They'll acknowledge it happened, but they won't elaborate, won't try to make it sound like a good scrap. Some Orks have been observed avoiding golden-colored objects after such encounters, or showing unusual caution when fighting forces they associate with the Custodians. This isn't conscious strategic thinking. Orks aren't capable of that level of planning. It's a deeper response, something almost instinctual, where the WH field itself retains a memory of the disruption and steers the collective away from similar situations. There's even been speculation among Imperial savants that prolonged exposure to Custodian forces can have lasting effects on Ork populations. Worlds that have been cleansed of Ork infestations by Custodian forces seem to have lower recurrence rates of greenskin presence compared to worlds cleared by other Imperial forces. The theory is that the psychic disruption caused by the Custodians somehow poisons the spores left behind, making them less likely to germinate or less effective when they do grow. This is unproven and probably impossible to verify, but the statistical correlation is suggestive. What's certain is that Custodian Dreadnoughts represent a threat to Orks that operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Physically, they're nearly unstoppable killing machines. Tactically, they're piloted by masters of warfare with centuries of experience. But psychically, they're something even more insidious. They're disruption nodes that attack the very foundation of what makes Orks effective warriors. They don't just kill greenskins, they break the bonds that make greenskin mobs function as coherent fighting forces. This is why the fear Orks feel when facing Custodian Dreadnoughts is so profound and so unusual. It's not just a reaction to physical danger. Orks face physical danger constantly and love every second of it. It's a response to existential threat, to something that attacks them on a level they can't consciously understand, but can definitely feel. The WH energy that normally makes them fearless and enthusiastic, warriors becomes disrupted, weakened, turned against itself. And in that moment of disruption, the Orks experience something they're not equipped to handle, genuine, bone-deep fear. Legends in Oromite, the heroes who pilot these machines behind every Custodian. Dreadnought is a warrior whose story deserves telling, because understanding who pilots these machines helps explain why they're so terrifyingly effective. These aren't anonymous soldiers operating weapons platforms. They're legends given mechanical form. Heroes whose deeds span centuries or even millennia. Warriors who chose to continue their service even after their bodies were broken beyond any hope of recovery. Let's begin with Sagittarius, the first of the Custodian Guard to be interred within a dreadnought. His story begins at the very dawn of the Imperium, when the Emperor was still personally creating his custodians through processes known only to him. Sagittarius was among the original 30 custodians, the first generation of guardians who stood beside the master of mankind during the darkest days of the unification wars on Terra. These were not battles fought with clean tactics and noble purpose. These were desperate conflicts against tyrants who wielded technologies from the Dark Age, against psychic abominations, against enemies who would stop at nothing to prevent humanity's unification. Sagittarius was described in the fragmentary records as choleric and wild, which by Custodian standards meant he was aggressive and favored direct action over careful planning. This doesn't mean he was reckless. No Custodian can be reckless and survive, but rather that his approach to warfare was more kinetic, more immediate than some of his brothers. He excelled at close-quarters combat, wielding his guardian spear with a fury that broke enemy formations and shattered the will of those who opposed the emperor. When he was finally wounded unto death, the records don't specify the exact battle or the enemy responsible. He faced a choice that would define the future of the Custodian Guard. He could accept death with honor, his name enshrined in the halls of the fallen, his sacrifice remembered, but his service ended. Or he could choose to continue fighting, to have his broken body interred within the cold sarcophagus of a dreadnought, to trade the sensations of life for an eternity of service in a mechanical shell. Sagittarius chose to fight on. He became the first of the Morotoi caste, the those who stand in death, custodians who refuse to let mere mortality end their vigil. His internment established a tradition that would last for 10,000 years, proving that even grievous injury couldn't stop the Emperor's guardians from fulfilling their duty. The psychological impact of this decision cannot be overstated. It told every custodian that service to the Emperor transcended flesh, that dedication could overcome even death itself. The records suggest that Sagittarius fought throughout the Great Crusade and possibly into the Horus heresy, though his ultimate fate is unknown. If he still serves in the 41st millennium, he would be over 10,000 years old, his consciousness maintained by arcane life support systems, his skills honed across literally thousands of battles. The thought is both awe-inspiring and terrifying. A warrior who has been perfecting his craft for longer than most human civilizations have existed, given access to a war machine that multiplies his already superhuman capabilities. Then there's Uriaxes, whose story is better documented because he continues to serve in the current era. He fell defending the walls of the Imperial Palace during the War of the Beast, when prime Orks of unprecedented size and power nearly succeeded in destroying the Imperium entirely. The Orks of that WH40K were not the degraded versions that would come later. They were massive, intelligent, and coordinated in ways that made them arguably the most dangerous threat the Imperium had faced since the Horus heresy. Uriaxes was stationed on a section of the palace walls when the Ork assault broke through, overwhelming the defenders through sheer weight of numbers. The records describe him fighting even as his body was torn apart, guardian spear still striking even as his limbs failed, his consciousness refusing to surrender even as his flesh gave out. When the position was finally retaken, the custodians found him barely alive, his body so damaged that even their advanced medical knowledge couldn't save him through conventional means. His internment in a dreadnought was not just a medical necessity, but a tactical decision. The War of the Beast was far from over, and every warrior who could still fight was desperately needed. Uriaxes woke in his new body and immediately requested assignment to the next crisis point. He has served continuously ever since, fighting through the Moirae schism against the Dark Mechanicus, standing immovable against the blood cults of Sidon, and continuing to wage war in the current era following the opening of the Great Rift. What makes Uriaxes particularly notable is his recorded attitude toward his service. In the few instances where his words have been preserved, he speaks of his internment not as a curse or even a sacrifice, but as an opportunity. His debt to the Emperor, he says, can never be fully repaid, not because the Emperor demands eternal service, but because Uriaxes himself has set his standards so high that he'll never meet them to his own satisfaction. This is the custodian mindset distilled to its essence, not serving because commanded to, but because anything less would be a betrayal of their own ideals. Consider the psychological profile this represents. Euryalus has been fighting for over 7,000 years. He's seen empires rise and fall. He's witnessed the gradual decay of the Imperium from its height during the Great Crusade to its current desperate state. He's fought enemies that most modern imperial forces have never even heard of, using tactics and strategies that have been forgotten by everyone except him and his fellow ancients. And he continues to serve not out of obligation, but out of genuine dedication to an ideal that he won't allow himself to compromise. When Orks face a dreadnought piloted by someone like Euryalus, they're not just fighting a machine, they're fighting 7 millennia of accumulated combat experience. Every trick they might try, he's seen before, probably thousands of times. Every tactic they might employ, he's defeated in the past and knows exactly how to counter. The Orks might be fighting their first battle against a Custodian dreadnought, but the Custodian dreadnought has fought thousands of battles against Orks and learned something from each one. Another legendary figure, though less well documented in the public records, is Historius Calaxor. Before his internment, Calaxor served as a shield captain, leading formations of Custodians through some of the most critical battles of the Horus heresy. He distinguished himself particularly during the defense of the imperial palace, where his tactical acumen and personal combat prowess helped hold crucial positions against traitor Astartes, who were, themselves, some of the finest warriors humanity had ever produced. When he was eventually wounded beyond recovery, his internment was seen as particularly fortunate by his fellow Custodians because his strategic mind could continue to guide them. A shield captain brings not just personal combat skill, but the ability to read entire battlefields, to coordinate multiple elements, to see patterns and opportunities that lesser warriors miss. In dreadnought form, Calaxor could apply this strategic vision while personally dominating sections of the battlefield that would otherwise require dozens of warriors to hold. The pattern we see in these biographies is consistent. The Custodians who are interred in dreadnoughts are not desperate soldiers clinging to a few more years of service. They're elite among the elite, warriors who had already distinguished themselves before their injuries, who choose to continue fighting because they literally cannot conceive of not serving the Emperor. Their internment doesn't diminish them. If anything, it amplifies what they already were, giving them durability and firepower that their flesh bodies couldn't match, while maintaining the skills and intellect that made them exceptional in the first place. This also explains why Custodian dreadnoughts are so individually distinctive in their combat approaches. Space Marine dreadnoughts, for all their pilots' experience, tend to fight in relatively standardized ways because they're products of regimented training and rigid combat doctrines. Custodian dreadnoughts fight as individuals, each one employing techniques and tactics that reflect their pilot's personality and accumulated experience. Some Custodian dreadnoughts favor aggressive, forward-pressing attacks, advancing into the thickest fighting and breaking enemy formations through sheer momentum. Others take more defensive positions, anchoring Imperial battle lines and allowing other forces to maneuver around them. Still others operate as solo hunters, seeking out and eliminating high-value targets with precision strikes. The variety is as broad as the personalities of their pilots, which makes them unpredictable and therefore even more dangerous. For Orks facing these machines, this individuality is deeply unsettling in ways they can't quite articulate. Orks understand hierarchy. They know that some Orks are bigger and tougher than others, that some are in charge and others follow. But they expect consistency within categories. A boss fights like a boss. A knob fights like a knob. But Custodian dreadnoughts don't fit into predictable categories. Each one is unique, each one fights differently, and the Orks never know what to expect until the killing starts. These legendary pilots also serve a psychological function within the Adeptus Custodes themselves. They're living, in the technical sense, connections to the Imperium's past, embodiments of continuity that stretch back to the earliest days of Imperial history. When young custodians, young by their standards, meaning perhaps only a century or two of service, fight alongside an ancient dreadnought, they're not just receiving tactical support. They're being taught by warriors who remember things that have passed out of living memory for everyone else. This teaching isn't formal or structured. Custodians don't operate that way. It's transmitted through observation, through seeing how the Ancient One approaches problems, through witnessing techniques and strategies that haven't been recorded in any training manual because they existed before there were training manuals. A young custodian might watch a dreadnought like Uriax's position himself on the battlefield and realize, through that observation, why that particular position is optimal in ways that weren't immediately obvious. That's knowledge that can't be programmed or taught through rote memorization. It can only be learned through experience or from those who have experience. The legends surrounding these ancient warriors also serve to inspire fear in the Imperium's enemies, Orks included. The Greenskins might not understand the full historical weight of names like Sagittarius or Uriaxes, but they understand enough to know that these are not normal opponents. They hear stories from other mobs about golden giants that can't be killed, about machines that fight with impossible skill, about warriors who've been killing Orks since before their warband's founding. And even Orks, for all their love of a good scrap, have enough survival instinct to be wary of enemies who've earned reputations like that. In the end, understanding the pilots of Custodian dreadnoughts is essential to understanding why they're so effective against Orks. These aren't random soldiers assigned to operate war machines. They're the finest warriors in human history, each one a legend in their own right, each one carrying centuries or millennia of accumulated skill and experience. When an Ork charges at a Custodian dreadnought, they're not just fighting a machine, they're fighting history itself, given form and purpose, and an absolute determination to never, ever fail in the defense of the Emperor's vision for humanity. The modern era, Custodians in the age of the Dark Imperium. The opening of the Great Rift and the subsequent fragmentation of the Imperium into Imperium Sanctus and Imperium Nihilus has fundamentally altered the strategic calculus of the 41st millennium. In this new age of darkness, where warp storms rage unchecked and demonic incursions are commonplace, the role of the Adeptus Custodes has expanded beyond its traditional boundaries. And with that expansion has come increased deployments of their dreadnoughts, bringing these legendary machines into contact with Ork forces more frequently than at any time since the War of the Beast. The current era presents unique challenges for the Imperium. The Orks, always numerous and aggressive, have been emboldened by the chaos. Multiple massive WH40Ks have erupted across both sides of the rift, led by cunning warlords who sense opportunity in the Imperium's distraction and division. Ghazghkull Thraka's campaigns alone have consumed dozens of worlds, and he's far from the only major threat. The Greenskins are having what could genuinely be called a golden age, with more opportunities for conquest and violence than they've enjoyed in millennia. Into this maelstrom, the Custodians deploy with increasing frequency. Where once they might have remained on Terra, except in the direst circumstances, the current crisis has demanded a more proactive approach. Small forces of Custodians, rarely more than a few dozen, often just a handful, are being deployed to critical flashpoints across the galaxy. And when they deploy, they often bring their dreadnoughts, because a single Custodian dreadnought can provide the kind of battlefield dominance that might otherwise require an entire company of space marines. Recent engagements have demonstrated that the fundamental dynamics we've discussed haven't changed despite the passage of 10,000 years. Orks still fear Custodian dreadnoughts for exactly the same reasons they did during the Great Crusade. If anything, the fear might be more pronounced now because modern Orks are, frankly, less impressive than their ancestors were. The prime orcs that nearly destroyed the Imperium during the War of the Beast were massive, intelligent, and coordinated. Modern orcs are degraded versions, smaller and less sophisticated, which means the gap between them and the Custodians is even wider than it was historically. One particularly well-documented engagement occurred in the Octarius sector, where orc forces had been fighting against a Tyrannid splinter fleet in what Imperial observers called the Octarius War. This conflict had been deliberately engineered by the Inquisition as a way to have two major threats to the Imperium destroy each other, and for a time it worked beautifully. But the orcs began winning through sheer adaptive evolution. Every generation of greenskins in the sector was being tested against one of the galaxy's most dangerous predators, and the survivors were getting bigger, smarter, and more dangerous. When it became clear that the orcs were not only going to win, but emerge from the conflict stronger than ever, Imperial forces were deployed to contain the situation. Among them were 3 Custodian Dreadnoughts, each assigned to anchor a key defensive position on different worlds. The deployment strategy was based on historical precedent. Place the Dreadnoughts at choke points, where they could force the orcs to engage on unfavorable terms, maximizing the disruption to the WH field, while minimizing the risk of the Dreadnoughts being overwhelmed through sheer numbers. The strategy worked exactly as planned. The orcs, fresh from victories against the Tyrannids and riding high on WH energy, charged into the Imperial positions with typical enthusiasm, and then they hit the Custodian Dreadnoughts, and the entire momentum of their advance just stopped. The reports from Space Marine observers describe watching thousands of orcs break like water against rocks, the WH energy visibly collapsing as the Golden Giants methodically dismantled mob after mob. What's particularly interesting about this engagement is that it was observed and analyzed by forces from multiple chapters, providing a wealth of comparative data about how Custodian Dreadnoughts compare to other Imperial assets. The Space Marines involved were veterans of countless battles against orcs, experienced warriors who knew exactly how dangerous greenskin forces could be. Their reports are uniform in expressing something close to awe at watching the Custodian Dreadnoughts in action. One report from a Blood Angels captain describes watching a Contemptor Achilles engage an orc mob that had just destroyed an entire tactical squad. The Golden One moved through them like a scythe through wheat. I have fought Xenos for over 2 centuries, and I have never seen such perfect efficiency of violence. Every motion served a purpose. Every strike was lethal. The orcs couldn't even slow it down. They tried to mob it as they do our dreadnoughts, but their numbers meant nothing. Where it walked, only corpses remained. Another engagement in the Vigilus system demonstrated how even modern orc warlords, cunning by the standards of their species, struggle to develop effective counter-tactics against Custodian Dreadnoughts. The orc forces on Vigilus were led by particularly intelligent nobs who had learned from previous encounters with Imperial Dreadnoughts. They deployed mobs with specialized anti-armor weapons, positioned their forces to concentrate fire, even attempted to lure Imperial Dreadnoughts into kill zones where they could be surrounded and destroyed. These tactics work reasonably well against Space Marine Dreadnoughts, which can indeed be destroyed if enough heavy firepower is brought to bear. Against Custodian Dreadnoughts, they accomplished essentially nothing. The anti-armor weapons that should have penetrated the Auramite armor just scarred the surface. The concentrated fire that should have overwhelmed the atomantic shielding was simply absorbed and dissipated. And when the Custodian Dreadnoughts counterattacked, moving with speed that made positioning them irrelevant, the carefully laid trap became a killing ground for the orcs themselves. The psychological impact on orc forces in the modern era appears to be even more severe than historical accounts suggest, possibly because modern orcs are less familiar with truly elite opponents. During the Great Crusade, the orcs regularly faced entire legions of Space Marines, each legion containing thousands of transhuman warriors. While they still lost to properly deployed legion forces, the orcs at least had the experience of fighting very dangerous enemies on a regular basis. Modern Orks mostly fight Imperial Guard regiments, planetary defense forces, or small detachments of space marines. They're used to winning through sheer numbers and enthusiasm, used to their tactics working eventually, even if they have to sacrifice thousands of boys to make it happen. So when they encounter something that their usual approach simply cannot defeat, the psychological shock is all the more profound. They're not just facing a powerful enemy, they're having their entire understanding of how warfare works fundamentally challenged. And Orks, for all their apparent stupidity, are smart enough to recognize when they're completely outmatched. They might not be able to articulate why the Golden Giant terrifies them, but they definitely feel it. The increasing deployment of Custodian forces in the current era has also led to more Orks surviving encounters with Custodian Dreadnoughts, which might seem counterintuitive, but makes sense when you consider the strategic situation. During the Great Crusade, when the Imperium was expanding and conquering new territory, the goal was often complete eradication of Xenos threats. Ork infestations were systematically eliminated, their spores hunted down and burned, the worlds they'd infected subjected to scorched earth protocols to prevent recurrence. In the current era, the Imperium simply doesn't have the resources for such thorough campaigns. The goal is often containment rather than elimination, stopping the Orks from advancing rather than completely destroying them. This means more Orks live through battles that include Custodian Dreadnoughts, which means more Orks spread stories about the Golden Giants. And these stories, passed from mob to mob, warband to warband, create a growing awareness among the green-skin population that there exists an enemy against whom even the WAG might not be enough. Some Imperial strategists have suggested this might actually be beneficial from a long-term perspective. If enough Orks develop a genuine fear of Custodian forces, the mere rumor of golden armored warriors might be enough to disrupt Ork operations in an entire sector. The Custodians themselves are too few to be everywhere, but if their reputation precedes them, they might not need to be everywhere. The fear itself could become a weapon, causing Ork mobs to avoid certain objectives, or hesitate at critical moments when that hesitation could mean the difference between an Imperial victory and defeat. This represents a fascinating evolution in how the psychological warfare aspect of Custodian deployments might function. During the Great Crusade, the goal was to inspire loyalty and confidence in human populations while terrifying Xeno species into submission or retreat. In the modern era, with the Imperium on the defensive and the Custodians deployed more actively, that terror has tactical applications that weren't as relevant 10,000 years ago. The technological advantage that Custodian Dreadnoughts enjoy has, if anything, increased over time. While the Imperium as a whole has experienced technological decline, unable to maintain, let alone improve upon the heights of the Dark Age of technology, the Custodians have managed to preserve their equipment with near-perfect fidelity. The Dreadnoughts fielded in the current era are maintained by tech priests and artificers who treat the machines as sacred relics, performing repairs and maintenance with a reverence usually reserved for religious icons. Meanwhile, Ork technology has arguably declined as well, not in the sense of becoming less effective, but in the sense that modern Orks don't create the kinds of truly impressive megastructures that their ancestors managed. The Gargants and Stompers of the current era are formidable, but they're not the city-sized monstrosities that the beast's WAG deployed. This means that even the largest Ork war machines are still within the capability envelope of what a Custodian Dreadnought can engage and destroy. Looking toward the future, or at least as much as anyone can predict in the chaotic present of the 41st millennium, it seems likely that we'll see continued or even increased deployment of Custodian Dreadnoughts against Ork threats. The opening of the Great Rift has created opportunities for massive Ork WHs to form and threaten critical Imperial assets, and the Custodians represent one of the few forces capable of stopping such threats before they become existential. A handful of Custodian Dreadnoughts, deployed to the right location at the right time, can break a wah before it reaches critical mass, preventing weeks or months of desperate fighting. the legend of these machines will only grow. Each engagement where a Custodian Dreadnought destroys an Ork mob adds to the cumulative weight of their reputation. Each surviving Ork who spreads tales of the Golden Giants helps ensure that future encounters will be colored by fear from the very beginning. And each new Custodian interred in a Dreadnought brings fresh skills and experience to the Moritoi cast, ensuring that the institutional knowledge and combat capability of these machines continues to grow rather than decline. In this age of the Dark Imperium, when humanity faces threats on every side, and the very stars themselves seem to conspire toward the species' extinction, the Custodian Dreadnoughts stand as reminders of what the Imperium once was and what it might yet become again. They are walking pieces of history, legends made manifest, proof that even in the darkest times, there exist warriors who simply cannot be defeated through normal means. And for the Orks who encounter them, they are existential nightmares, enemies who break all the rules of how warfare should work, and who inspire a fear that no amount of Waig energy can overcome. Conclusion: the weight of Golden Terror. We've journeyed through the mechanics, the history, the psychology, and the reality of what happens when Orks face Custodian Dreadnoughts. We've examined the savage simplicity of the Greenskins, who live for nothing but war, and yet find themselves terrified of these particular opponents. We've explored the terrible perfection of the Custodians themselves, transhuman warriors who transcend normal human capability to such a degree that they might as well be a different species entirely. And we've seen how these two forces interact on the battlefield, creating a dynamic that defies the usual patterns of warfare in the 41st millennium. The fear that Orks feel when facing Custodian Dreadnoughts is not merely reaction to physical danger. Orks face physical danger constantly and embrace it with enthusiasm. What they fear is something far more fundamental: the complete invalidation of what makes them effective warriors. The Waigi energy that usually carries them through any fight meets something it cannot overcome. The toughness and resilience that usually lets them shrug off horrific injuries proves insufficient against weapons that don't just wound, but disintegrate. The numbers that usually guarantee eventual victory become meaningless against enemies who can kill faster than the mob can reinforce. This is a different kind of fear than what humans experience. Humans fear death, pain, failure, loss. Orks don't really understand those concepts in the same way. What they fear is ineffectiveness, the realization that they're not good at the one thing they were created to be good at. Fighting is supposed to be fun, even when you're losing, because the act of combat itself is satisfying to the Orkish psyche. But there's nothing fun about being systematically dismantled by an enemy operating on a completely different level of capability. The Custodian Dreadnoughts themselves represent something unique in the Warhammer 40,000 setting. In a universe where almost everything is declining, where technology is being lost and traditions are being forgotten, where humanity is locked in what appears to be an endless losing battle against entropy and chaos, these machines stand as exceptions. They are preserved pieces of the Imperium's golden age, maintained with a care and reverence that borders on the religious, piloted by warriors whose dedication transcends normal human understanding. When we talk about the grimdark nature of Warhammer 40,000, we're usually discussing the horror, the suffering, the brutality of a universe where life is cheap and hope is scarce. But there's another aspect to the setting that's sometimes overlooked: the majesty, the wonder, the sheer awe-inspiring nature of what humanity once achieved and what fragments of that achievement still remain. The Custodian Dreadnoughts embody this aspect. They're terrible and beautiful, instruments of death that are also works of art, machines of war that are simultaneously monuments to human capability. For the Orks, encountering these machines is perhaps the closest they can come to a religious experience, and not the good kind. It's the revelation that there exist forces in the universe against which their usual advantages count for nothing, That being bigger doesn't always mean being better, that even the WAG energy has limits beyond which it cannot push them. This realization strikes at the core of Orkish identity in ways that would be existentially devastating for creatures with more complex psychology. The historical record supports this interpretation. Across 10,000 years of warfare, whenever Custodian forces have deployed against Orks, the result has been remarkably consistent. The greenskin formations break, the WH40K collapses, and the threat is neutralized with minimal casualties among the Golden Warriors. The specific tactics might vary, the theaters of war might change, but the fundamental dynamic remains constant. Custodians, and especially Custodian Dreadnoughts, represent a hard counter to Ork psychology and tactics in ways that even the finest Space Marine forces don't quite match. This isn't to say that Custodian Dreadnoughts are invincible. Nothing in the 41st millennium truly is. With sufficient numbers, preparation, and luck, even these mighty machines can be brought down. But the cost of doing so is typically so prohibitive that it's rarely worth attempting. The Orks who might succeed in destroying a Custodian Dreadnought would need to commit such overwhelming force to the effort that they'd be vulnerable everywhere else, and the casualties they'd suffer in the process would likely break the wire anyway. As we look to the future of the setting, it seems clear that Custodian Dreadnoughts will continue to play a crucial role in humanity's defense against the greenskin menace. Each engagement where they demonstrate their superiority adds to their legend. Each Ork who survives an encounter spreads stories that make the next encounter slightly easier because the fear is already planted. And each new Custodian interred in a Dreadnought adds to the institutional knowledge and capability of the Moritoi caste. The Orks will continue to be one of the primary threats facing the Imperium. Their numbers are too vast, their reproductive rate too high, their love of warfare too fundamental to their nature for them ever to be completely eliminated. But as long as the Custodian Guard maintains their Dreadnoughts and continues to deploy them strategically, the Imperium possesses a tool capable of breaking even the largest WH40Ks before they reach critical mass. The story of Custodian Dreadnoughts versus Orks is ultimately a story about the collision between two extremes of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. On one side, you have the Orks, crude, numerous, enthusiastic, representative of quantity over quality, of chaos over order, of instinct over intellect. On the other side, you have the Custodians, refined, rare, deliberate, representative of quality transcending quantity, of perfect order, of intellect applied to violence with surgical precision. When these two forces meet, there's no real contest, not because the Orks are weak, but because they're facing something that exists outside their conceptual framework for how combat should function. It's like watching a medieval knight try to fight a modern tank. Both are warriors, both are dangerous in their contexts, but the tank operates according to rules that the knight simply cannot compete with using the tools and tactics available to them. The fear that Orks experience when facing Custodian Dreadnoughts is the fear of irrelevance, the fear of discovering that you're not playing the same game as your opponent, that you've brought crude weapons to a duel with perfection itself. And while Orks might struggle to articulate this fear, to explain why these particular golden giants terrify them in ways that other enemies don't, they definitely feel it. The WH energy that usually makes them fearless encounters something it cannot overcome, and in that moment of weakness, the Orks understand, perhaps more clearly than they understand anything else, that they are utterly, completely outmatched. So the next time you're reading about the Warhammer 40,000 setting, or playing a game where Custodian Dreadnoughts face off against Ork forces, or just imagining what these battles must look like, remember, this isn't just about stats and rules and dice rolls. It's about the collision between two philosophies of warfare, two approaches to existence itself. And in that collision, the golden giants stand, triumphant, their dread spears wet with greenskin blood, their pilot's consciousness satisfied that duty has been fulfilled one more time, their legend growing with every orc who runs in terror rather than stand and fight. The Custodian Dreadnoughts are, in the end, exactly what the Imperium needed them to be. Weapons so perfect, so devastating, so psychologically overwhelming that they inspire fear even in the most fearless species in the galaxy. They are walking testaments to what humanity achieved at its height, preserved through 10,000 years of decline, still serving, still killing, still protecting the Emperor's vision for mankind. And the orcs who face them learn, in the moments before they die or flee, that there are forces in the universe against which even the Warg is not enough. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most fascinating dynamics in Warhammer 40,000 lore, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. We explore the grim darkness of the far future in all its terrible glory, examining the stories, the battles, and the characters that make this setting so compelling. The Imperium may be a monument to humanity's brutality and desperation, but it's also home to moments of genuine heroism and achievement. And the Custodian Dreadnoughts represent both aspects in perfect synthesis. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Warhammer 40,000 lore. Until next time, remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But sometimes, there are also golden giants who fight that war with a perfection that borders on the divine.